Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about The Dream of the Rood, which I'm reading out of the Broad View Anthology of English Literature for the Medieval Period. So, The Dream of the Rood, that's hard to say when it's actually dated to, because the earliest written version we have, according to the editors of the Broad View, comes from the Vercelli book, which is the 10th century, so the 900s. But there's a cross called the Ruthwell cross, and you can see a black and white picture of it right there. And this has lines from the Dream of the Rood carved into it. The Ruthwell cross comes from the early 8th century, so if those carvings are original rather than having been added later, then that pushes the date for the composition of the Dream of the Rood back at the very latest to the beginning of the 8th century, probably more 7th century. One of the upshots of that is that this poem then was written before the rise of what's called affective piety, which is basically still maybe not largely, but still a major component of Christian theology and iconography today. So basically, affective piety is focused on depicting Christ's suffering. So whenever you see a crucifix with Jesus on it, and he's looking all tortured and pained and whatever, whenever you see a late medieval Renaissance or after painting of Jesus on the cross where he's all twisted in agony and stuff like this, affective piety. That is what that is. The focus is on suffering. Christ's suffering to redeem the world. Prior to that, there was a strain of Christian theology and iconography that we see both in poetry like Dream of the Rood, but also in paintings, in stained glass, in these other visual depictions, that's sometimes called Christ Triumphant. And the idea was basically that there's a grand cosmological battle between Christ and death, to a lesser extent against sin. And Christ is a warrior for humanity. He fights death, defeats death, and he is therefore triumphant. So he's more in the vein of somebody like Beowulf or maybe King Arthur than he necessarily is in the sense of the affective piety Christ. Like Christ suffering on a cross is not the same as Christ triumphant. Christ triumphant is often depicted again as a warrior. He's often presented in armor. He often has a sword. He is successful against death. And this was very appealing to particularly Northern Europeans who had come out of these pagan traditions. The Anglo-Saxons, prior to being converted to Christianity, had a pantheon of gods somewhat like the Norse gods worshipped by the Vikings. Instead of Odin, the Anglo-Saxons had Woden. Very similar figures. And then you think about something like, again, Beowulf is a really good example. It is a nominally Christian poem, but it's extremely influenced by older Anglo-Saxon pagan traditions, which still had a lot of cultural currency throughout the early portion of the Middle Ages, really up until the 10th century, 12th century. There's different dates for when sort of affective piety becomes the default in European Christianity. But regardless of that, the Dream of the Rood is quite clearly comes from this pre-affective piety era, very much inflected by traditional Anglo-Saxon warrior and pagan culture. So, to start out, this is a dream. This is presented as a dream of the Rood, obviously. The first lines say, "Listen, I will speak of the sweetest dream, what came to me in the middle of the night when speech-bearers slept in their rest." And what this poet persona dreams is that the true cross appears to him. The Rood is another name for the cross, or the true cross. And basically the cross gives its perspective on having been the instrument upon which Christ is crucified. And this is strewn throughout with these images of battle, of violence, of warfare, and of triumph. So, for instance, the poet persona refers to the victory tree. That's the cross. The tree, for reasons that don't fully make sense to me, medieval literature often refers to the cross as a tree. Yes, it was probably made of wood. So the victory tree is the cross, the cross with which Jesus conquers death through his own demise. It says here, wounded with guilt. That's the cross. The cross was wounded with guilt for its part in Jesus' death. A little bit later, it refers to the ancient wretched struggle, the struggle with death. A little bit later, after Jesus has died, or he's been brought down from the cross, he's described as weary from his mighty battle. And then he's called the Lord of Victories. So again, we have this very battle-centered iconography of Jesus, that he is a warrior fighting with death. And the whole thing is really presented by the cross in this dream as a battle. And so the cross gives its autobiography in a way. I'll read you a portion of it. The cross says, "It was so long ago, I remember it still, that I was felled from the forest's edge, ripped up from my roots. Strong enemies seized me there, made me their spectacle, made me bear their criminals. They bore me on their shoulders and set me on a hill. Enemies enough fixed me fast. Then I saw the Lord of mankind hasten eagerly when he wanted to ascend upon me." This is actually another part of the Christ triumphant ideology, that Jesus is not crucified against his will, but that he actually goes joyfully to the crucifixion in the way that an ideal Anglo-Saxon warrior would seek out battle for glory, for success, for triumph. And so this imagery gets sort of incorporated into the notion of Christ's battle with death. "I did not dare to break or bow down against the Lord's word when I saw that the ends of the earth tremble. Easily I might have felled all those enemies, yet fast I stood. Then the young hero made ready, that was God Almighty. Strong and resolute, he ascended on the high gallows, brave in the sight of many when he wanted to ransom mankind. I trembled when he embraced me, but I dared not bow to the ground, or fall to the earth's corners. I had to stand fast. I was reared as a cross. I raised up the mighty King, the Lord of heavens. I dared not lie down. They drove dark nails through me. The scars are still visible, open wounds of hate. I dared not harm any of them. They mocked us both together. I was all drenched with blood flowing from that man's side after he had sent forth his spirit." So again, this is very much set up as a battle. And it's a battle in which the cross, the Rood, is wounded, is grievously wounded. And yet through that suffering, through that wounding, and through the cross's devotion to being the instrument of Christ's torture and death, the battle is won. Ultimately, Christ is victorious. So we've got that, and it's really very, very different from, again, the sort of modern conceptions of Jesus, which tend to revolve around affective piety. But then the other element that we've got that's striking is the last portion of the poem. We go back to the poet persona, the speaker who has had this dream, and they reflect on the meaning of this dream and their hopes for heaven through sort of renouncing worldly desires, worldly ambitions, etc., etc. So the poet persona here says, I have few wealthy friends on earth. They have all gone forth, fled from worldly joys, and sought the King of glory. They live now in heaven with the High Father, and dwell in glory, and each day I look forward to the time when the cross of the Lord, on which I have looked while here on this earth, will fetch me from this loned life, and bring me where there is great bliss, joy in heaven, where the Lord's host is seated at the feast, with ceaseless bliss. So that's interesting, because the idea of a loned life, the idea that our experiences on earth are temporary, but God or the divine or heaven or the soul is eternal, and that we merely borrow the trappings of our earthly existence, that's very much a Christian idea, especially a medieval Christian idea. But then this image where the Lord's host is seated at the feast, I think is really interesting, because I don't know, I may be wrong about this, but I'm not really familiar with many Christian teachings that imagine heaven specifically as a feast. They may be out there and I don't know about them. I'm not a specialist in this, but that, to me, very much sounds like a sort of Valhalla type afterlife, right? Because the key elements of Valhalla, the sort of the Scandinavian term that by the Viking era people were using, I don't know what the Anglo-Saxon equivalent would have been, but the idea was basically that if you died in battle, you ascended to Valhalla, you lived with the gods, and you would fight throughout the day, and you would feast throughout the night. So feasting was a major component of the Norse pagan conception of heaven. And I don't know that it's a major component of traditionally Christian conceptions of heaven. So again, there's this interesting thing in which the Anglo-Saxons clearly are converted to Christianity. I think in the 6th century, 5th century, something like that, they're converted. But the Anglo-Saxon conception of Christianity is reshaped by their traditional pagan beliefs in order to appeal to people who were traditionally pagan. Like, Christianity incorporates these elements from Anglo-Saxon pagan religion and builds them into the Christian story, so that the transition from paganism to Christianity is not as jarring. We see those remnants in poems like The Dream of the Rood or Beowulf.